The storm came without mercy. By nightfall, the entire stretch of the Wyoming frontier was swallowed by a white, howling void. Wind screamed through the pines, tearing at roofs and fences, burying the world under an endless tide of snow. Somewhere out there, the mountains vanished behind a curtain of gray, and the land itself seemed to stop breathing. Caleb Rourke leaned forward in his saddle, his hat pulled low and his scarf frozen stiff against his jaw. The snow bit like fire, stinging his eyes as he guided his horse along the ridge. He'd spent the night tending to cattle for a rancher 20 miles north, and now he was heading home before the storm turned deadly. But even through the roar of wind, something gnawed at his instincts, the kind of unease that only old cowboys learned to trust. Down in the valley below, something didn't look right. Between the snowdrifts and dead trees, a shape jutted out, a blackened chimney poking from a mound of timber and ice. Caleb slowed his horse, squinting through the veil of white. The longer he looked, the colder his gut grew. That wasn't a snowbank. It was a cabin, or what was left of one. He kicked his horse forward, riding hard through knee-deep drifts until he reached the ruin. The wind moaned around him as he dismounted, boots sinking into the soft powder. He dropped to his knees, brushing away the snow with his gloved hands. The cabin had caved in, its roof splintered, one wall crushed flat. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. For all the world, it looked like a grave. He listened. Nothing but wind. Then, faintly, from beneath the wreckage something stirred. A sound that froze him mid-breath. It wasn't the wind at all. It was a cry. Weak. Human. "Hello," Caleb shouted, cupping his hands to his mouth. "Can you hear me?" No answer came, only another muffled whimper, softer now, like a sound fading into the snow. Panic surged through him. He didn't waste another second. He tore off his gloves and started digging. The cold sliced through his fingers like knives, but he didn't care. He flung aside logs, shards of glass, and handfuls of ice, each breath coming out in ragged clouds. The wood scraped his skin raw, his knuckles bleeding as he clawed through the wreckage. Beneath the surface, the snow was packed hard and heavy. It fought him with every inch. "Hold on," he gasped, half to himself, half to whoever was trapped inside. "I'm coming." Minutes passed, maybe hours. His muscles screamed, his hands were numb and red, but finally he reached a pocket of air. He peered inside and saw her. A young woman lay half buried under the fallen beams, her hair matted with frost, her lips blue from cold. In her arms she clutched a small bundle wrapped in a torn quilt, a baby, pressed tight to her chest. Caleb's heart kicked hard in his chest. "Ma'am," he said, voice low but urgent. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered. Her face was pale as snow. "Don't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't let her freeze." Her words hit him like a knife to the ribs. He reached in, wedged his shoulder under a broken beam, and heaved until his back burned. The wood gave way with a groan. He scooped her and the baby into his arms, holding them close against his chest. The child was frighteningly still, its tiny hand limp. He stumbled through the snow, carrying them both to his horse. "Come on, girl," he urged, swinging into the saddle with the woman in front of him, her head lolling weakly against his shoulder. He wrapped them in his heavy wool coat, pulling it tight around the baby. The wind cut like blades, but he kept riding. The nearest sign of life was his cabin, a good 8 miles west, across frozen ground and howling winds. Every hoofbeat felt like a prayer. He leaned forward, whispering softly into the woman's ear even though she couldn't hear him. "Stay with me. Don't you give up now." Snow lashed his face, and his vision blurred. The world had turned to a blur of white and gray. Once, he thought he heard the baby's cry again, a faint, gasping sound that made him push the horse harder. When the first outline of his cabin appeared through the storm, Relief nearly buckled his knees. Smoke still rose from the chimney, thank God for that. He rode straight to the door, kicked it open, and stumbled inside with the two fragile lives cradled against him. The warmth of the fire hit his face, and for the first time in hours he could breathe. He laid the woman gently on his bed, unwrapped the child, and pressed his trembling fingers to its tiny chest. There a heartbeat. Weak but steady, Caleb sank to his knees beside them, exhaustion washing through him. Snow melted off his shoulders and pooled on the floorboards, but he didn't care. He had found them in the wreckage of the storm, and for now they were alive, and that was enough. The fire crackled low, filling the cabin with the smell of pine and smoke. Caleb Rourke crouched by the hearth, his breath still ragged from the storm. Snow melted off his coat in dark puddles, dripping from his sleeves as he worked to stoke the flames higher. Behind him, the woman and her baby lay motionless on the bed, wrapped in his heavy wool coat. He moved fast. Years of trail life had taught him how to act when seconds mattered. He filled a pot with snow and set it over the fire, waiting until it turned to water. Then dipped a cloth and began rubbing the woman's hands, her arms, her face, anything to bring warmth back to her pale skin. "Come on now," he muttered, his voice low and rough. "You made it this far. Don't quit on me now." Her lashes trembled. Her lips were still blue, but her chest rose in shallow, uneven breaths. That was enough to keep him moving. Then his eyes turned to the baby. The tiny thing lay bundled in torn fabric, cheeks gray with cold, a ghost of life in its fragile body. Caleb's hands shook as he lifted the infant against his chest. The little head rested under his chin, and he pressed his palm over its back, feeling for warmth. There was barely any. He didn't think, just acted. He stripped off his damp shirt, pressed the baby against his skin, and wrapped both of them in a blanket by the fire. His own body heat was all he had to give. For long minutes, the cabin was silent except for the pop of burning wood and Caleb's whispering. "You hold on, little one. You hear me? You hold on." And then, faintly so faint he almost doubted it, came a soft sound. A tiny whimper. Caleb froze. He looked down, eyes wide. The baby's mouth moved again, letting out a weak, breathy cry. He exhaled a long, trembling sigh, half laugh, half sob. "That's it. That's what I wanted to hear." He fed the child drops of warm milk from a rag, slow and careful. When he was sure the baby was breathing steadily, he turned back to the woman. She still hadn't opened her eyes. Her hair clung to her face, wet and tangled, and her dress was stiff with frost. He soaked another cloth, rubbed her wrists, and gently turned her head toward the firelight. "You saved her," he whispered, glancing at the baby. "Now it's time to let me save you." Her eyelids fluttered again. She made a faint sound, half sigh, half moan. Caleb leaned closer. "You're safe now, ma'am," he said softly. "You're in my cabin. Storm's still going, but it can't touch you here." Her voice came in broken fragments. "The roof fell. I thought." "You thought wrong," he cut in gently. "You're alive, both of you." Her gaze flicked to the child. "My baby?" "She's fine," he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Feisty little thing. Already mad at the world." Tears welled in the woman's eyes. She tried to move, but Caleb placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Easy now. You've got frostbite starting on your fingers. Just rest." Outside, the wind still howled, rattling the cabin walls, but inside there was a fragile peace, like a small flame holding back a storm. Caleb fed the fire, added more blankets, and pulled up a chair beside the bed. He wasn't leaving them for a second. Hours passed. The woman drifted in and out of sleep, murmuring things that didn't make sense, names, prayers, fragments of fear. Each time she stirred, Caleb was there, quiet and steady. Making sure she stayed warmed out when the worst of the storm began to ease, he finally leaned back, exhaustion dragging at his bones. He looked at her face so delicate, almost ethereal in the firelight, and felt something stir inside him that he hadn't felt in years. Not love, not yet, but purpose. He'd been drifting since the war, working ranch to ranch, never staying long enough to care about anything. But now, staring at that woman and her baby breathing softly in his bed, Caleb realized that for the first time in a long while, he'd done something that mattered. When the woman awoke again, hours later, her eyes focused on him. "You saved us," she whispered. Caleb shook his head, staring into the fire. "No, ma'am. Just did what anyone should have done." But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. Not everyone would have stopped in that storm. Not everyone would have dug through a frozen cabin with bare hands. Something bigger than duty had driven him. Something he couldn't quite name yet. The baby whimpered softly, and Caleb stood, lifting the little bundle with surprising tenderness. The woman watched him, this rough cowboy with frostbitten fingers, moving with the care of a father. For a long moment neither spoke. Only the crackle of fire filled the room, warm and alive against the storm outside. Then, softly, she whispered, "Thank you." Caleb nodded once, still cradling the baby. "You rest now," he said quietly. "You're safe. Both of you." And for the first time in many winters, Caleb Rourke allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he'd found a reason to keep riding home. The storm raged for 2 more days, fierce enough to bury fences and break trees in half. Caleb's small cabin, tucked against a rocky ridge, held its ground, the logs creaking under the weight of snow. Inside, the world was smaller, warm, dim, and filled with the sound of fire crackling and a baby's soft breaths. Caleb hadn't slept much since he'd carried them in. He dozed in a chair by the hearth, boots still on, gun within reach. Every few hours, he'd check the baby's breathing, add more wood to the fire, and make sure the woman stayed wrapped tight beneath layers of blankets. The woman, Evelyn, he'd learned from the initials stitched inside her baby's quilt, was slowly coming back from the edge. Her cheeks had regained a hint of color, and her hands, though blistered from frostbite, could now hold the cup of broth he fed her. She'd asked little and spoken even less, her voice soft as falling snow. But her eyes followed him whenever he moved around the cabin, watching this tall, scarred stranger who had saved her and her child. On the morning of the 3rd day, sunlight broke through the storm clouds, turning the snow outside into a blinding sea of white. Caleb stepped out for the first time, squinting against the glare. His horse, Daisy, stood by the shed, sides crusted with frost but alive and steady. He gave her an apple from his pocket and patted her neck. "You did good, girl," he murmured Dot when he stepped back inside. The cabin was quieter than before. Evelyn was awake, sitting upright now, rocking her baby gently. The firelight softened the hollow look in her face. "Morning," Caleb said, setting down the bucket of melted snow. "You're looking stronger." "I feel it," she said, her voice still hoarse. "You? Stayed up all night again?" He shrugged, hanging his hat on a nail. "Didn't feel like sleeping. Had to make sure that little one of yours kept breathin'." Her lips trembled into something close to a smile. "She owes you her life." Caleb shook his head. "Reckon you did most of the work. You kept her alive till I got there. That's a fightin' heart right there." Evelyn looked down at her daughter, her thumb tracing the edge of the baby's cheek. "Her name's Clara," she said softly. "She's all I have left." Caleb hesitated. He didn't ask what that meant. Not yet. Instead, he busied himself at the stove, heating up some beans and bread. "You'll need real food soon," he said. "Broth ain't enough to keep you strong." "I don't want to be a burden," she murmured. He turned, meeting her eyes. "You're not. You're just staying alive." That's what this place is for. Something passed between them in that moment, unspoken but heavy. Gratitude, maybe. Or the first fragile thread of trust. Later that afternoon, as the light softened and the wind calmed outside, Evelyn tried to stand. Her legs wobbled, and Caleb was there instantly, one arm steadying her. "Easy," he said. "You'll walk when your body's ready. Don't rush it." "I need to move," she insisted weakly. "If I stay still too long, I'll go mad." He helped her to the chair by the fire, slow and careful. Her fingers brushed his arm, a fleeting touch that made her flinch and blush, though he didn't seem to notice. He was already pouring her water, his movements quiet and deliberate. "You remind me of someone," she said after a while. "Oh?" He asked without looking up. "My father. He was a rancher, too. Quiet, stubborn, never sat still. You even sound like him." Caleb chuckled, a low sound that warmed the room. "I'll take that as a compliment." For a few minutes, silence settled comfortably between them. The baby stirred, and Evelyn hummed softly, a melody so faint it barely reached the walls. Caleb listened, elbows on his knees, and felt something tighten in his chest. The sound of her voice, it made the cabin feel like a home, not just four walls against the cold. When night came, he checked the fire again before sitting down in his chair. Evelyn's eyes were heavy with sleep, her baby nestled against her chest. "You should rest too," she murmured. "I'll manage," he said. "Do you ever stop watching over people?" He looked into the flames. "Only when there's no one left to watch." She didn't know what that meant, but the sadness in his tone lingered even after her eyes closed. Outside, the snow began to melt in slow trickles down the roof. The worst of the storm had passed. Inside the cabin, a fragile peace settled two souls and a child bound together by chance, by the cold and by the desperate fight to survive. Caleb sat back in his chair, the baby's quiet breathing filling the silence, and thought that maybe, just maybe, saving them had saved him too. By the time the snow melted enough for the trails to show again, Evelyn Porter could sit up, eat solid food, and even take slow steps across the cabin floor. The baby Clara had color in her cheeks again, cooing softly from a cradle Caleb had built out of spare pine boards. The cabin felt alive now, where silence once pressed heavy. There was warmth, firelight dancing on rough-hewn walls, the smell of stew simmering, and the faint hum of a lullaby when Evelyn thought no one was listening. Caleb sat at the table, sharpening his knife with a steady rhythm. He'd been quiet all morning, as he usually was. Words didn't come easy to him. They never had. But that didn't stop Evelyn from watching him, the way he moved, how careful he was with everything, how he never raised his voice, not even once. "You live alone out here?" she asked finally, breaking the silence. He nodded without looking up. "Mostly. Suits me fine. No family?" "Not anymore." The sound of the knife stopped. The air between them grew still. Evelyn didn't press further, sensing a shadow behind those three words. She turned back to Clara, rocking her gently, though her curiosity burned. Who was this man who had risked his life for strangers, who worked like a storm but spoke like a ghost? After a while, Caleb cleared his throat. "What about you? You said your name's Evelyn Porter?" She nodded. "Yes, my husband and I built that cabin you found us in. We moved out here last spring. Thought we'd start a small homestead. Land was cheap and the valley soil's good." Caleb's eyes softened. "You picked a hard stretch of country." Evelyn smiled faintly. "We knew that, but we wanted something of our own, a place no one could take from us." Her voice faltered at that, the smile fading. Caleb waited, silent, giving her space. She swallowed. "He left 3 days before the storm. Said he was riding east to the trading post for supplies. He never came back." The words hung between them, heavy and raw. Evelyn looked toward the window, the snow glare bright against the glass. I tried to keep the fire going. The roof was already weak. When it gave way, I thought, maybe that was God's way of saying it was over. Her eyes glistened, but she blinked the tears back quickly. Then I heard your voice. Caleb shifted, uncomfortable under the weight of her gaze. Luck, that's all, he murmured. No, she said softly. It wasn't luck. You could have ridden right past. He didn't answer. Instead, he got up, poured her some water, and handed it to her with a nod. You'll need strength. The snow's still deep out there. Can't go far till it melts. She took the cup but didn't drink. You don't talk much, do you? He huffed a quiet laugh. Not unless I've got something worth saying. That drew a real smile from her, the first he'd seen since she woke days ago. It changed her face entirely. For a second, she didn't look like a woman who'd survived the edge of death. She looked like someone who belonged in sunlight. That night, after supper, Evelyn sat by the fire while Caleb mended his saddle straps. The baby slept in her cradle, tiny breaths rising and falling. Outside, the sky had cleared. The stars sharp and cold over the mountains. Evelyn broke the silence again. You said? Not anymore. Your family. Caleb's hand stilled. For a moment, he looked like he might ignore the question. Then, quietly, he said, Had a wife once. Long time ago. She got sick. Fever took her before I could get her to town. Evelyn's throat tightened. I'm sorry. He nodded once, jaw set. Ain't your sorrow to carry. But I reckon that's why I couldn't just ride past your cabin. Not again. The firelight flickered across his face, catching the grief buried deep in his eyes. Evelyn wanted to speak, to tell him that saving her and Clara was more than enough redemption for whatever ghosts he carried. But the words caught in her throat. Instead, she reached over and placed her hand lightly on his arm. It was a small touch, barely there. But it said what words couldn't. I understand. Caleb looked at her, then at the baby sleeping beside them. And for a moment, the storm outside the cabin, the loneliness, the memories, all of it seemed to quiet. Rest, he said finally, his voice low. You'll need it. When the weather clears, I'll ride out and look for your husband. You deserve to know. Evelyn nodded, her eyes shining in the firelight. Thank you, Caleb. He only nodded once more, pulling his coat tighter around his shoulders as the wind whispered against the cabin walls. But long after Evelyn fell asleep, he sat there, staring into the flames, knowing deep down what he was likely to find out there in the snow and wishing he could spare her from that truth. The dawn broke pale and cold, a thin mist curling off the snowbanks as the sun struggled to rise over the frozen ridge. Caleb Rourke was already awake, packing his saddlebag with jerky, matches, a flask of coffee, and a small tin of salve for his cracked hands. His movements were silent, but sure he'd done this kind of ride 100 times before. Only this time, there was a heaviness pressing down on him, a knowing that what he'd find out there wouldn't be good. Evelyn stirred on the cot by the fire, blinking sleep from her eyes. You're leaving? She asked, her voice small in the morning quiet. He paused, cinching the strap on his pack. Just for a spell. You need to know what happened to your husband. She sat up quickly, clutching the blanket to her chest. You don't have to. Yes, I do. He looked at her, eyes steady but gentle. Ain't right, leaving it unknown. You deserve an answer, even if it's not the one you want. Her lips parted, but no sound came. After a long moment, she only nodded. Then promise me something, she whispered. If you find him. If he's. She couldn't finish. Caleb nodded once. I'll bring him home proper. One way or another. Evelyn swallowed hard and reached for his hand. Her fingers were soft but cold. Be careful, Caleb. He gave a faint smile. I always am. Outside, The world was silent except for the crunch of his boots and the creak of saddle leather. The snow had hardened overnight, making travel easier but unforgiving. He mounted his horse and rode east, following the faint memory of a trail one Evelyn said her husband had taken toward the trading post. The land stretched wide and white, dotted with frozen pines and jagged rocks half buried in snow. The only sound was the horse's breath puffing in clouds and the steady rhythm of hooves. Caleb's eyes scanned the distance for any sign tracks, a campfire, a fallen pack. But all he saw was emptiness. Hours passed. He stopped once to rest the horse, kneeling in the snow to examine a half-covered indentation, a boot print, maybe a day or two old. He followed it downhill into a narrow gulch, where the snow had drifted deep against the rocks. There, at the base of a cedar tree, he saw it. A hand, pale and stiff, reached out from beneath the snow. Caleb froze, jaw tightening. He dismounted slowly, brushing away the drift until the man's face emerged, eyes closed, lips blue. The frost had taken him peacefully, it seemed. His coat was torn, and beside him lay a small sack of supplies beans, flour, a few nails, and a letter sealed in wax. Caleb removed his hat and knelt beside him. "You did your best," he murmured, voice rough with respect. "You tried to make it home." He dug a shallow grave beneath the cedar, using his small shovel and his bare hands when the ground grew too hard. The work was slow and silent, interrupted only by the whistle of the cold wind through the trees. When it was done, he placed a wooden cross made from 2 branches and whispered a prayer he hadn't spoken in years, from the man's coat. Caleb took one thing, a silver ring, dulled by frost but still shining faintly in the morning light. Inside the band, engraved in delicate script, were the letters E+J. He tucked the ring into his pocket and stood for a long moment, looking out across the white valley. Then he turned his horse toward home. By the time he reached the cabin again, the sun was dipping low. Smoke rose from the chimney, and through the frosted window he could see Evelyn by the fire, rocking her baby, her face lit with quiet hope. Caleb's chest ached. When he stepped inside, the warmth hit him like a wave. Evelyn looked up instantly, searching his face. One look told her everything. Her eyes glistened, but she didn't speak. Caleb reached into his coat and pulled out the ring. He didn't hand it to her. He just set it gently on the table between them. Her breath hitched. She picked it up slowly, running her thumb over the engraving, her shoulders trembling. He was a good man, she whispered, voice breaking. "I could tell," Caleb said quietly. "He fought hard to come back." She nodded, tears spilling freely now. "Did he suffer?" "No," Caleb lied softly. "He just went to sleep." Her hand flew to her mouth as she turned away, shoulders shaking. Caleb stood there, hat in hand, helpless against her grief. He wanted to comfort her, to say something that might ease the hurt, but there was no such thing as gentle truth. When it came to loss. When she finally turned back, her face was streaked with tears, but her voice was steady. "Thank you for bringing him home." Caleb nodded once. "He's buried by a cedar near the ridge. Strong place. The kind a man would have chosen himself." She whispered a prayer under her breath, holding the ring tight in her palm, and in that small cabin, beneath the fading light of a winter sunset, 2 souls who had both buried their past sat in silence, bound by loss, by mercy, and by the quiet understanding that survival always came with a cost. The snow outside had started to melt, forming small rivulets that snaked down the hillsides. For the first time in weeks, the world seemed to exhale. But inside Caleb's cabin, the air was heavy with something that didn't thaw as easily. Grief. Evelyn sat near the fire, the baby cradled against her chest, the silver ring still clutched in her hand. She hadn't spoken much since Caleb returned. She didn't need to. The silence between them said more than words ever could. Caleb moved quietly about the cabin, fixing a loose hinge on the door, checking the roof for leaks, chopping wood when he needed to step outside. He gave her space. It wasn't the kind of hurt you talked someone through. It was one you just stayed beside until it stopped bleeding. That evening, when the baby finally slept, Evelyn's voice broke the silence. "How do you do it?" Caleb looked up from where he sat sharpening a hatchet. "Do what?" "Keep going," she said softly. "After losing someone you love." His hand stilled on the blade. The question hit deep, straight through the armor he'd worn for years. He set the hatchet down and leaned back, staring into the fire. "Truth is," he said after a long pause, "I didn't. Not for a while. I kept breathin', eatin', ridden. But that ain't the same as livin'." Evelyn's eyes stayed on him, her face calm but weary. "What changed?" He gave a humorless laugh. "Nothin'. Or maybe time. Or maybe I just got tired of being a ghost." She nodded slowly, her gaze falling to the ring in her hand. "I keep thinking he's going to walk through that door," she whispered. "That if I just wait long enough, I'll hear his boots in the snow." Caleb's voice softened. "You ain't wrong to hope. But some things, they don't come back. Not the way we want 'em to." The firelight flickered over their faces, painting them both in shades of amber and shadow. Outside, the wind had softened into a whisper. The storm's fury long gone. Caleb rose and went to the stove, pouring 2 mugs of coffee. He handed one to her. "Drink, it'll help." She took it, the warmth seeping into her fingers. "You take care of everyone, don't you?" she said quietly. He smiled faintly. "When I can. Who takes care of you?" That question caught him off guard. He blinked, then chuckled softly. "Don't think anyone's ever asked me that." She tilted her head. "Maybe someone should." For a moment, their eyes met and something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't romance yet, not even comfort in the usual sense. It was something quieter. Older two broken hearts recognizing the same kind of ache in each other. Over the next few days, the cabin filled again with small sounds, Evelyn humming to the baby, the creak of Caleb's boots as he worked outside, the steady rhythm of rebuilding life. He fixed the baby's cradle, carving smooth edges where splinters caught. He mended her wagon wheel without being asked. Every action of his was silent kindness, the kind that didn't draw attention to itself. One afternoon, Evelyn stood by the window, watching him chop wood. His shirt clung to his shoulders, his movements strong but patient. There was something deeply human in the way he worked, steady, grounded, carrying his pain with dignity. When he came inside, cheeks red from the cold, she said softly, "You could have left us." "Most men would have." Caleb looked at her, brow furrowed. "Couldn't do that. Why?" He hesitated, then shrugged. "Because I know what it's like to be left with nothing but the wind for company." Her throat tightened. She stepped closer, resting her hand lightly on his arm. "You're a good man, Caleb Rourke." He gave a small, shy smile. "Ain't sure about that. Just a man who couldn't ride past." That night, after Evelyn and the baby had fallen asleep, Caleb sat by the fire, staring at the small cradle glowing in the firelight. The soft breaths of mother and child filled the room like a prayer. For the first time in years, he felt peace settle in his chest, not the loud, blazing kind, but something steady and warm. In the silence, he whispered to himself, "You done good, boy. Don't mess this up." He didn't know if the words were for the memory of his past or for the fragile present he'd built within those cabin walls. All he knew was that the ache in his chest no longer felt like emptiness. By the time dawn returned, Evelyn woke to find fresh logs stacked by the door, a repaired saddle waiting on the porch, and Caleb already outside, feeding the horses. She smiled quietly to herself, feeling for the first time since her husband's death that the world wasn't just cold and cruel. Somehow, In the wreckage of the storm, she and her baby had been given a second chance. And maybe, just maybe, so had the cowboy who refused to stop caring. The snow had finally surrendered to the sun. What had once been a silent, frozen world now shimmered with meltwater and the early hum of spring. The air smelled of wet pine and thawing earth. The land was waking, and so were they. Evelyn stood outside the cabin, her skirts brushing against the damp grass. The baby, whom she'd named Clara, gurgled softly in her arms, fascinated by the flutter of a bluebird on a fence post. Caleb was nearby, tightening a saddle strap on his bay horse. "Boone, you're leaving again?" she asked quietly, her tone calm, but her eyes uncertain. Caleb glanced over his shoulder, then back at his horse. "Just for a spell. Need to ride into town, trade pelts, fetch more supplies. And," he hesitated, "get you something proper for the baby. Milk, medicine, maybe a few things that ain't patched up with pine needles." Evelyn smiled faintly. "You've done enough already." He shook his head. "Not near enough." Their eyes met for a long moment. She wanted to thank him for his hands that had dug through the snow, for his patience, for his quiet presence, but words never seemed enough. Caleb gave a small nod, as if reading her thoughts, and mounted. "Boone, won't be long," he said. "You two'll be just fine." She nodded, hugging Clara closer as he rode off down the muddy trail, the rhythmic thud of hooves fading into the distance. The cabin felt too quiet after he left. Over the next few days, Evelyn worked to bring the small homestead back to life. She mended the roof with bark and sap, set a small garden bed out back, and learned the sound of the land birds returning, creeks rushing, the gentle sigh of wind through fir trees. Each sound reminded her that life could begin again. Even after lost out at night, when Clara slept, Evelyn would sit by the window and watch the moon climb over the ridge. She found herself thinking of Caleb more than she wanted to admit. His steady voice, his way of fixing things without being asked, the rare warmth in his eyes when he smiled. She remembered how he'd told her he used to be married. Years ago, before the war and the loneliness that followed. He'd never spoken her name, but Evelyn didn't need to hear it to understand the pain behind his silence. When Caleb returned 5 days later, the first thing he noticed was the smoke from the chimney. The second was Evelyn herself standing by the garden with her baby on her hip, sunlight tangled in her hair. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, swinging down from his horse. "Didn't think I'd find you farmin' already." Evelyn laughed, brushing dirt from her hands. "A woman's gotta eat. And so does a baby." Caleb smiled, pulling a small burlap sack from his saddle. "Brought something for both of you." Inside were tins of milk, a blanket soft as rabbit fur, and a tiny carved horse for Clara. Evelyn's throat tightened. She touched the wooden toy, running her fingers over its rough edges. "You made this?" He nodded. Figured she might need something to hold on to. "Can't fix the world, but I can carve a horse." Her eyes glistened. "You're a good man, Caleb." He shifted awkwardly, rubbing the back of his neck. "Don't know about that. Just a man trying not to make things worse." Over the next week, life found a rhythm. Caleb fixed the barn roof and broke new ground for planting. Evelyn cooked again simple meals that smelled of herbs and warmth. They shared quiet dinners, the baby asleep between them in her cradle. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, Caleb found Evelyn sitting on the porch steps, the wind lifting strands of her hair. "You ever think about leaving?" he asked softly. She didn't answer right away. "Sometimes," she admitted. "But then I remember there's nowhere left to go. Everything I loved is gone. Except this place. And maybe that's enough." Caleb nodded slowly. "This land's got a way of giving you something back if you stay long enough." Evelyn turned to him, her voice gentle. "And what has it given you?" He looked at her, then really looked, and for the first time, he didn't look away. "A reason to stay," he said quietly. For a moment, neither spoke. The air was golden, heavy with the scent of pine and the promise of spring. Clara stirred in her cradle, cooing softly, as if agreeing with the silence between them. Caleb reached over and took Evelyn's hand. Rough met soft. Scar met healing. And in that simple touch, the loneliness of two broken souls began to fade like the last of winter, melting into the warmth of a new season. That night, as the firelight flickered over the cabin walls, Evelyn whispered to the baby, "We're home now." And for the first time, she believed it that by late summer, the valley had bloomed back to life. Wildflowers brushed the meadows in pink and gold, the air thick with the hum of bees and the scent of new grass. The cabin that once lay broken under snow now stood proudly, its roof patched, its windows shining, its walls alive with laughter. Evelyn hung linens on the line, the baby now toddling in the grass beside her. Clara's giggles echoed through the warm afternoon air. Her cheeks were round with health, her small hands clutching at dandelions. Each sound, each laugh was proof that life had come full circle. Caleb was down by the creek, mending a fishing line. His broad shoulders gleamed in the sun, the muscles in his forearms flexing with quiet ease. He looked up occasionally to make sure the little one hadn't wandered too far. And every time, his face softened just a little more. Evelyn called down to him, "You'll scare the fish with all that watchin'." Caleb grinned. "Ain't my fault the view's better up here than down in the water." She laughed, shaking her head, pretending not to blush. It had been nearly 6 months since the storm that nearly took her life. 6 months since Caleb had dug her and Clara from the ruins of a broken world. In that time, the three of them had built something new, something stronger than survival. As the day cooled, Evelyn joined Caleb by the creek, sitting on the smooth stones beside him. Clara toddled between them, fascinated by the reflection of the sky in the water. Caleb handed Evelyn a small wooden box. "Been meaning to give you this," he said quietly. She opened it, revealing a delicate silver locket, the one she'd once worn but thought lost in the collapse. Inside was a small photograph of her late husband and a lock of hair. Evelyn's breath caught. "You found it?" "Buried under the old cabin," he said, voice low. "Didn't reckon it right for it to stay there." Tears shimmered in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, fingers trembling around the locket. He nodded, his voice rough. "He was a good man, wasn't he?" She smiled through her tears. "He was. And so are you." They sat in silence for a while, the creek whispering beside them, the sun painting their faces in gold. Finally, Evelyn spoke again. "You gave us more than a second chance, Caleb. You gave us a home." He looked down, his voice barely a murmur. "Didn't do it for thanks." "I know," she said softly. "That's what makes it mean something." The baby splashed her hands in the water, squealing with delight. Caleb laughed, a deep, unguarded sound that startled even him. Evelyn joined in, and for a moment, the grief that had shadowed them both seemed to lift completely. That night, after putting Clara to bed, Evelyn found Caleb outside, sitting on the porch with his hat tilted back, watching the stars. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and joined him. "You ever think about going back east?" she asked quietly. He shook his head. "Ain't nothing back there for me." "What about you?" She smiled faintly. "My past is buried under snow. My future, well, she's asleep inside that cabin." He chuckled. "Fair enough." The night stretched on, filled with the gentle sounds of crickets and the crackle of the fire. Finally, Evelyn turned to him, her voice almost a whisper. "Caleb, I don't know what this is between us or what it's supposed to be, but I know I'm not afraid anymore." He met her gaze, his hand finding hers in the dark. "You don't have to be," he said simply. For a long moment, they sat together, their fingers intertwined, the sky wide and endless above them. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, just two hearts that had found peace where pain used to live. Weeks later, travelers passing through the valley would see smoke rising from the chimney, a woman tending her garden, and a cowboy teaching a laughing child to ride a pony. They'd hear stories about how that cabin had once collapsed under a blizzard, and how a man dug through ice and ruin to bring life back into it. Some said it was luck. Others said it was love. But those who really knew the story said it was something rarer, the quiet kind of courage that builds again when the world falls apart. And so the cabin stood stronger, warmer, fuller than before. Not because the storm had spared it, but because two broken souls had chosen to rebuild it together. As the sun set behind the mountains that evening, Caleb leaned against the doorframe, watching Evelyn tuck Clara into bed. The baby's soft laughter drifted through the open window. He smiled, tipping his hat low. "Guess we made it after all," he murmured. And in the heart of the valley, where winter had once nearly claimed them, the sound of life and love rose steady and true once more.